Night in Dusty Creek was never truly silent. Crickets chirped unseen along the banks of the dried-up river. Coyotes called far out on the prairie. And somewhere beyond the circle of lantern lights, restless horses stamped the earth, uneasy. But tonight, the hush felt different, thicker, almost suffocating, as if the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for something to go wrong. Sheriff John Miller had ridden out earlier, coat collar up against the wind, hat pulled low. The moon was only a sliver, barely enough to cast shadows. He'd gone alone, despite Lily's protests. She'd waited on the porch, arms folded tight across her chest, watching the empty street as the sound of his horse faded down the trail. It wasn't like John to leave after dark without a word to his deputies. But these were not ordinary times. For weeks now, rumors of a wagon loaded with stolen army rifles had drifted in with the dust. Rifles meant for the Union, intercepted by outlaws, now passing hands somewhere near Dusty Creek. John had tracked those whispers doggedly, angering men in high places, pushing hard even as the town's respect for him soured into muttered complaints. The last few nights, Lily noticed the way he slept with one hand on the pistol beneath his pillow, and how the kitchen table was cluttered with cryptic maps, lists of names, and half-burned letters she wasn't allowed to read. Tonight, something had changed. John rode out, jaw clenched, badge shining dull in the lantern light. Lily had almost called out to him, almost begged him to wait until morning, but she knew better than to get between her husband and his duty. Instead, she locked the door, sat by the window, and listened to the old clock tick away the hours. She must have drifted off, because the next thing she remembered was the sharp, desperate sound of boots pounding on the street outside. A voice shouted for help. Lanterns snapped on. Windows flew open, and Lily's heart kicked hard against her ribs. She flung open the door and ran barefoot into the muddy street, the cold shocking her fully awake. The scene before her looked like something out of a nightmare. Under the harsh yellow lantern glow, John lay sprawled in the mud, blood darkening his shirt, hat knocked away. His right hand was clenched around his badge, as if even in dying he refused to let it go. The deputy, Tom Harper, stood frozen, face pale as milk, while townsfolk gathered in a widening circle drawn by the spectacle. Lily dropped to her knees in the muck, heedless of her nightgown, clutching John's shoulders, shaking him, willing him to open his eyes. The silence was pierced only by her ragged breathing and the steady drip of blood pooling beneath his chest. She pressed her hands to the wound, but she already knew it was hopeless. John's gaze was unfocused, lips parted as if to speak. For a moment, she thought she heard him whisper her name, but the only sound that escaped was a final rattling sigh. Someone pulled at her arm, trying to lead her away, but Lily shook them off with a strength she didn't know she had. She reached for the badge, prying it from his stiffening grip, feeling the warmth of his blood on her skin. She pressed it to her chest, rocking back and forth as the world spun around her. Lantern light flickered over her face, painting her with shadows. Widow's mask, forged in grief and fury. Around her, voices began to rise. Men shouted questions, arguments erupted, and accusations flew. Someone blamed the McCoy gang. Others muttered about politics, debts left unpaid, or even John's own stubborn pride. Lily heard none of it. In her mind, everything narrowed down to the weight of the badge, the blood on her hands, and the gaping void where her husband had been. By sunrise, Dusty Creek was a town transformed. News of the sheriff's murder traveled faster than any horse, faster even than truth itself. At every poker table, saloon, and cattle camp, stories twisted and grew. Some swore they'd seen masked riders fleeing into the hills. Others whispered of a traitor inside the sheriff's own office. The old-timers shook their heads, muttering that Dusty Creek was finished, cursed by its own lawlessness. In the tiny cabin at the edge of town, Lily sat alone by the cold hearth, John's badge lying heavy on the mantel. Outside, the world kept turning. Wagons creaked down Main Street, cowhands who'd never liked the sheriff tipped their hats and rode on by. But inside, grief settled over Lily like a suffocating fog. She pressed a hand to the glass, watching as the town she'd tried to call home pulled away from her, brick by brick, word by poisoned word. Yet even as sorrow threatened to swallow her whole, a hard resolve began to take root. The world might think her weak, a woman alone, shunned and whispered about. But Lily Miller was her father's daughter, born of pioneers and fighters. She stared at the badge on the mantel, the only thing left of her husband's honor, and whispered into the silence, "If you can't finish what you started, John, then I will." Unseen, a shadow moved across the frosted window, lingering for a heartbeat before slipping away into the pre-dawn gloom. Out beyond the edge of the lamplight, the night still belonged to men who killed in secret and laughed in the face of justice. But Lily Miller's war had just begun. Morning came with a bitter edge. The sky over Dusty Creek was a flat, unforgiving gray, promising nothing but more cold. The little cabin at the town's edge felt emptier than ever, its walls closing in around Lily Miller. Sleep had not come. Instead, she had sat by the dying embers all night, staring into the heart of the fire, willing herself not to cry. Each time her eyelids drooped, memories stabbed through, the heavy thud of John's body hitting the mud, the metallic tang of blood in the air, the strange hush that followed his last breath. No one knocked on her door. No one came by with condolences or even a plate of food. Lily's grief was her own to carry, and the townsfolk seemed relieved to leave it with her. She could almost feel their stares through the thin cabin walls, their voices drifting like smoke on the wind. It ain't right. A woman living out here alone always was too proud for her own good. Maybe John Miller wasn't the saint he played at. The whispers were knives, each one cutting a little deeper, until the world outside felt as hostile as the bandits in the hills. The sun had barely risen when Lily forced herself to move. She washed John's blood from her hands in the icy water pump behind the house, scrubbing until her skin turned raw and pink. She gathered her tangled hair in a loose knot, dressed in a faded blue dress, and tidied the place, more from habit than hope. Every piece of furniture was a memory. The battered chair where John once dozed, the crooked nail above the door where his hat used to hang, the old hunting rifle he'd never let her touch. Lily lingered over his badge, now polished and gleaming in the morning light, feeling both comforted and tormented by its presence. The town, meanwhile, was coming alive with rumor. At the saloon, rough men nursed their breakfast whiskeys and swapped theories. At the mercantile, women traded stories in huddled knots, their faces pinched with worry or glee, depending on which side they stood. At every corner, Lily's name was spoken, but never with kindness. It was as if John's murder had stripped her of any protection he'd offered, leaving her exposed to the chill of Dusty Creek's suspicion. She tried to keep her head down, but trouble had a way of finding her. The McCoy gang, bold as ever in the wake of John's death, sent their message before noon. It came on a scrap of dirty paper, tucked under a stone by her doorstep. "Whatever your husband found, it belongs to us now," the note read, the letters smeared and angry. "Hand it over, or you'll be next." Lily crumpled the threat in her fist, jaw clenched, and stuffed it in the stove until it burned away to nothing. But fear crawled up her spine anyway, cold and relentless. Inside, she paced the tiny room, her mind racing. She thought of John's late-night mutterings, the way he'd scrawled in his journal and locked it away before bed. She remembered arguments, his insistence on secrecy, his vague warnings to trust no one, not even friends. Now, every shadow in town seemed longer, every face more closed off. Deputy Tom Harper, once a regular guest at their table, had not returned since the murder, and the few other lawmen kept their distance, eyes averted, as if her grief were contagious. Hunger gnawed at her, but Lily ignored it. Instead, she set herself to work, fixing the broken latch on the door, oiling the hinges on the window, sweeping the floor with a vengeance. Each task became a ritual, a way to keep her mind from drifting to the endless questions. Who had killed John? Why had no one seen or heard anything? What secret had he died to protect? By late afternoon, a storm was brewing. The sky darkened and the air thickened, as if the world itself was suffocating beneath the weight of what had happened. Lily gathered firewood, glancing over her shoulder at every rustle in the brush, every shifting cloud. She found herself clutching John's badge, tucking it into her pocket, a silent promise pressed against her palm. The wind picked up, howling around the corners of the house, carrying with it distant laughter from the direction of the McCoy camp. As darkness fell, the threats grew bolder. A stone crashed through the kitchen window, sending glass across the table. Lily flinched, then stood frozen, heart hammering. Outside, the night was a wall of blackness, but she heard it. The unmistakable snort of a horse, the shuffle of boots, men's voices low and mocking. She pressed her back against the door, staring at the Colt revolver John had left behind, its grip worn smooth by his hand. For a moment, fear nearly broke her. She wanted to run, to hide, to beg for help. But another feeling rose up inside her, hot and fierce, rage. The town might scorn her, the gang might threaten her, but she would not be driven out, not from the house she'd built with her own hands, not from the memory of the man she'd loved. She drew a shaky breath, knuckles white around the revolver, and stared down at John's badge. Outside, thunder rolled across the plains, shaking the tiny house to its foundations. Lily did not flinch. She set the badge on the mantel and squared her shoulders, facing the storm as she had faced every hardship before. "If you can't finish what you started, then I will," she whispered again, voice low and steady. As the storm raged, the town's whispers faded beneath the drumbeat of rain on the roof, but Lily remained wide awake, eyes fixed on the darkness, waiting. She would grieve later. For now, she would survive. That night, as the storm's fury finally eased, Lily Miller lay awake on her narrow bed, every sense straining for the slightest sound. The rain had cleansed the streets, but left her mind muddy and unsettled. Every creak of the cabin, every sigh of the wind seemed loaded with menace. But exhaustion finally won, and she drifted into a shallow, restless sleep, one ear trained on the darkness, the other on the echo of her own heartbeat. Just before dawn, a chill seeped into her bones and pulled her from her uneasy dreams. The wind had died down, but something felt wrong, an unnatural silence, heavy and expectant. Lily pushed herself up, pulling John's old flannel shirt tighter around her shoulders. She moved through the cabin with cautious steps, checking the latch on every window, the lock on the door. The air inside was tinged with the memory of last night's fire, now cold in the grate. She was about to turn away when her toe caught on a loose floorboard near the kitchen. She frowned. The wood had always been uneven, but tonight it shifted with a hollow, telltale thud. Kneeling, Lily pried the plank up with trembling fingers. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth and dust, she found two things: a weathered leather journal and John's prized Colt revolver. Her hands shook as she lifted them out, setting them in the lamplight on the table. The journal was filled with page after page of John's tight handwriting. Notes on the comings and goings in Dusty Creek, coded messages, and, most chillingly, a list of names, some she recognized from around town, others she had never heard before. Among them were powerful ranchers, outlaws, and at least one deputy's name circled twice in ink. There were sketches of wagons, lists of cargo, and a final entry hastily scrawled, "Do not trust anyone," evidence hidden beneath. Lily's heart pounded as she realized the scale of what John had been chasing. He'd been close to something big, something worth killing for. She turned to the revolver, running her thumb over the worn grip. It felt heavy, dangerous, but strangely reassuring in her hands. If the McCoy gang wanted what John had found, they would have to come through her to get it. The sky had barely begun to lighten when Lily heard footsteps crunching in the yard. Her blood went cold. She doused the lamp and pressed herself to the wall, heart hammering, every muscle tensed. Through the crack in the curtain, she saw shadowy figures moving near the porch. 3, maybe 4 men, faces hidden by kerchiefs and wide-brimmed hats. Their movements were slow, deliberate, like men with a purpose. A sudden crash shattered the pre-dawn silence. The kitchen window exploded inward as a rock sailed through, glass shards glittering in the weak light. One of the masked men kicked in the back door, shouting for Lily to hand over the journal. Another hurled a burning rag onto the wooden floor. The sharp stink of kerosene filled the cabin, and flames leapt hungrily, casting wild, dancing shadows on the walls. Lily snatched the journal and revolver, clutching them to her chest as she ducked behind the battered table. Her mind raced, not with fear, but with the cold, steady clarity that comes when every second counts. She remembered the hidden trap door at the back of the pantry, barely big enough for a grown woman, a relic of the days when outlaws raided the edge of town. She crawled across the floor, heat licking at her heels, smoke stinging her eyes. The men shouted curses as they searched the cabin, overturning furniture, ripping drawers from their tracks. Lily's fingers found the latch. She wrenched the trapdoor open and slid down into darkness, pulling it shut behind her. The space below was cramped and musty, lined with stone, but it was safety, at least for the moment. Above her, flames roared and boots thudded across the boards. For what felt like hours, Lily crouched in the darkness, clutching the journal and revolver, barely breathing. The fire above crackled and spat, smoke curling through the floorboards, but the men's voices faded as quickly as they'd come, leaving only chaos in their wake. When at last the heat receded and the sounds died down, Lily pushed her way up, coughing and blinking through the haze. The cabin was in ruins, windows blown out, soot staining the walls, the air thick with the stench of smoke and burned cloth. The men had not found the journal, but they'd left their warning clear. Lily stumbled out into the gray morning, the journal pressed to her chest, mind whirling with questions. She could not go to the sheriff's office. The deputy had been absent all night. and trust was now as rare as gold dust in this town. She made her way to the pump, scrubbing the soot from her arms, adrenaline finally giving way to raw fear. For the first time, the truth settled in. The traitor she hunted was not a distant outlaw or some faceless gunman. It was someone here. Someone who knew the shape of her life, who had watched her and John and chosen the perfect moment to strike. As the sun finally climbed over the battered rooftops of Dusty Creek, Lily understood the brutal reality. She was not just fighting for justice or for her husband's name. She was fighting for her own survival. And the enemy was not only outside her door, but might be hiding behind a badge, a neighbor's smile, or a friend's handshake. In that smoky dawn, Lily Miller squared her shoulders, journal and Colt at her side, and made her silent vow. She would not run. She would not bow. She would bring the truth into the light, even if it cost her everything. And she would remember the lesson John had written in his last entry. Do not trust anyone. By midday, the ruins of Lily's cabin stood as a grim warning at the edge of Dusty Creek. The charred remains of the back door hung crookedly. Smoke-stained curtains fluttered in the breeze, and footprints in the wet earth marked the path of men who wanted her silenced. But Lily would not be driven out. She salvaged what little she could, John's badge, the scorched revolver, and the battered journal, pages only slightly singed around the edges. Each item felt heavier, charged with meaning now that the town itself seemed to turn its back on her. Word of the attack spread quickly. A few neighbors rode by to gawk at the damage, eyes wide with fear or thinly veiled curiosity. But no one offered a hand. The McCoy gang's message was clear. Stand with Lily and risk sharing her fate. She swept the porch in silence, her movements slow and methodical, until the last ember was out. Ash clung to her skin, mixing with sweat and grit. With the sun beating down, Lily knew she needed help, and there was only one man in town she could even halfway trust, Deputy Tom Harper. She found him at the edge of the livery stable tending a nervous sorrel mare. His movements were jerky, eyes darting from the street to the door, as if he expected trouble with every breath. When Lily approached, Tom stiffened, hat in hand, glancing at her out of the corner of his eye. She wanted to ask about the night John died, about the things left unsaid and the gaps in his story. She watched Tom closely, searching for a flicker of guilt, a tremor in his voice. But he was all politeness and apologies, mumbling about being busy at the jail, about the sheriff's work piling up. When she pressed for help, his eyes slid away, and he muttered vague promises that left her colder than before. The badge on his chest seemed suddenly out of place, tarnished in the harsh sunlight. Lily's stomach twisted with suspicion. John had trusted Tom, but had he trusted the right man? Turning away from the livery, she headed down Main Street, the journal tucked deep in her satchel, her mind swirling with doubt. The town felt changed. Eyes followed her from shaded doorways, whispers rose and fell behind shuttered windows, and every familiar face seemed tinged with uncertainty. Even the breeze felt hostile, hot and dry, pushing her onward as if to hasten her departure. Dusty Creek's only saloon, the Starlight, was a place of noise and relief. Cool shadows, the scent of spilled whiskey, and the murmur of voices clustered around battered tables. Lily's presence drew stares, a ripple of silence. Then the clatter of resumed conversation. She moved through the crowd, gaze steady, ignoring the sideways glances and sly comments. She sat at the end of the bar, back to the wall, watching the room through the haze of cigar smoke. That's when she noticed him, a stranger nursing a glass of rye in the corner, half his face in shadow. His hat was pulled low, and a long scar cut from his cheekbone to his jaw. There was a heaviness in his posture, a man who'd seen too much and trusted too little. The bartender gave him a wide berth, as did the regulars. He watched the room with wary eyes, assessing every movement, every threat. Lily felt his gaze settle on her, sharp and appraising, like a hunter sizing up his prey. For a moment, neither moved. Then he tipped his glass in her direction, a silent acknowledgement. She recognized something familiar in his weariness, a kindred spirit, marked by loss and hardened by survival. A game of cards broke out near the door, voices rising in laughter and curses. One man accused another of cheating, and for a heartbeat, tension knifed through the air. The stranger shifted, his hand drifting to the pistol at his side, but the moment passed. Lily took a steadying breath. She needed allies, but trust was dangerous currency. Still, desperation pressed her forward. As the evening wore on, the stranger finally rose and sauntered over, boots thudding against the warped floorboards. He introduced himself as Jake Collins, a former bounty hunter, he claimed, with old scores to settle against the McCoy gang. His voice was low and rough, his words edged with a challenge. Jake made it clear he wasn't offering help out of kindness. He wanted a share of any reward that might come from justice, whatever form that took. Lily considered his offer. In her mind, she weighed the risk. Jake was no hero, and his past was clouded with violence. Yet, in a town that had abandoned her, he was the only one willing to stand beside her, even if for his own reasons. With a nod, she accepted. Out of options, Lily Miller found herself bound to a man she barely knew, trusting that his hunger for vengeance would keep him loyal, at least until the truth was exposed. As night fell over Dusty Creek, the saloon's lamps flickered, casting strange patterns on the walls. The uneasy alliance had begun, forged in the ruins of her old life, fueled by secrets, suspicion, and a shared hatred for the men who'd turned the town into a battlefield. And somewhere outside, in the darkness between the buildings, the McCoy gang watched and waited, ready for the next move in a deadly game. The days that followed felt stretched thin. Time pulled taut between hope and dread, every hour bristling with unspoken threats. Lily and Jake Collins became unlikely partners, shadowing each other through the dust and heat, their names whispered in every corner of Dusty Creek. With her late husband's badge buried in her pocket and Jake's cold watchfulness beside her, Lily pressed forward, driven by purpose and something darker, the certainty that the enemy was always watching. Their first step was the bartender at the Starlight. Under the pretense of routine questions, Lily and Jake pieced together scraps of information from the bar's shadowed corners. The bartender, a nervous man with darting eyes, stammered half-truths about strangers riding through town, hinting at secret deals in back rooms and uneasy alliances between wealthy ranchers and the McCoy gang. Jake stood nearby, arms folded, gaze hard, silent but unmistakably threatening. The bartender's resolve crumbled quickly. He admitted to seeing unfamiliar horses stabled behind the saloon in the dead of night, their brands covered in mud. From there, the investigation wound through the pens at the edge of town, where Lily and Jake counted more horses than the town's cattlemen could explain. Fresh tracks cut through the soft earth, boots and hooves, moving under cover of darkness, always toward the same direction. A ramshackle barn outside the old abandoned cattle yard. Lily's nerves tightened at every step, her senses alive to the possibility of ambush. The barn itself seemed to breathe with secrets, its doors swinging slightly in the afternoon wind, the faint odor of sweat and gun oil lingering just beneath the scent of hay. Inside, Jake found boot prints in the dirt, a half-smoked cigar still warm beside a battered crate, and a torn scrap of paper, more coded notes in John's handwriting. Lily recognized the shorthand from the journal hidden in her satchel, names and numbers, a map of Dusty Creek with certain streets circled, times scrawled beside them. She pressed the page to her heart for a moment, feeling both closer to John and more hunted than ever. Evening brought them back into town, where Lily's suspicions sharpened on Deputy Tom Harper. Each time she caught sight of him, he was slipping around corners, his eyes nervously scanning the horizon. Jake watched him too, silent as a shadow. At the jailhouse, Tom's stories never matched. First he claimed to be searching for leads at the edge of town. Then he swore he'd been with the mayor all morning. When Lily pressed him about the break-in at her cabin, Tom's hands trembled, and his eyes darted away, never meeting hers. The badge on his chest looked heavy, the silver dulled by secrets. The nights grew more dangerous. One evening, Lily caught a flicker of movement outside her window. A silhouette crouched in the alley, watching her every step. Jake was never far, and his presence was a silent reassurance. Together, they stalked through the shadows, eavesdropping on whispered meetings behind closed doors. In the lamplight of the general store's back room, they overheard two wealthy ranchers muttering about a shipment leaving Dusty Creek soon. A shipment that would make the McCoy gang rich enough to buy the law itself. Jake's confidence was a weapon, but Lily's determination was the steel that held their alliance together. As she tracked the web of betrayal, the outlines of the conspiracy became clearer. The McCoy gang was planning a massive shipment, guns, gold, and stolen army rifles, right under the noses of the townsfolk. With at least one traitor feeding them every move from inside the sheriff's office, every clue brought the danger closer, but also sharpened Lily's resolve. One afternoon, as thunderclouds gathered overhead, Lily and Jake circled back to the barn near the cattle yard. This time, they found signs that someone had been there since dawn. Fresh hoofprints, a canteen still dripping beside the wall, and in the dirt, a set of initials carved with a knife. T.H. Jake and Lily exchanged a look. Deputy Tom, the one man John had trusted, was always gone when something bad happened. Always returning with excuses, always sweating when she asked about the case. In that moment, the web of suspicion tightened until it felt like a noose. Still, there was no time for confrontation. The town itself was bracing for trouble, its streets thick with strangers and its nights haunted by the threat of gunfire. Every window glimmered with fear. Every conversation stopped when Lily entered a room. Yet step by step, she pushed forward, guided by the clues John had left and the conviction that justice was not yet dead in Dusty Creek. With Jake at her side and the journal hidden safe, Lily prepared for the fight to come. She understood now. Corruption ran deeper than anyone dared admit, and even the law could not be trusted. But her enemy had made a mistake. She was no longer just a grieving widow. She was a woman with nothing left to lose, hunting the truth through the ruins of a town built on secrets. As dusk bled into night and a restless wind swept through the streets, Lily set her jaw and stared into the dark. The evidence was clear, the danger near, and the reckoning had only just begun. As a restless dusk spread over Dusty Creek, Lily Miller felt the invisible cord of danger draw tighter around her. For days now, she and Jake had lived like foxes, moving by shadows, collecting whispers, tracing the lines of betrayal from saloon to barn to cattle yard. Each step brought them closer to the rotten heart of the town's secrets, but it also brought new risks. Threats had become routine. She no longer jumped at the sound of boots on the porch or glances through the dusty window. Fear was a dull ache, replaced by something sharper, resolve, hunger for the truth, and a grim knowledge that she was being watched from every angle. The air that evening was thick with storm warning. Clouds bruised the sky above the rooftops, and thunder rumbled far off on the prairie. Lily lingered in the parlor, running her hands over John's journal, memorizing the names, the cryptic messages, the times and places he'd underlined in frantic haste. She thought of Deputy Tom Harper, his evasive answers and nervous eyes. Jake's suspicions echoed her own, but proof was still a ghost, visible only from the corner of her mind. When a note slid under her door, Lily's stomach twisted. The handwriting was familiar, quick, slanted, anxious. "Come to the old grain shed at sundown. Alone. I have what you need." It was signed, T. She hesitated, then tucked the Colt into her waistband, slipped the journal beneath her coat, and headed out, boots crunching on the brittle grass. The town watched her from behind curtains and half-closed shutters, wary of the woman who refused to disappear. She reached the grain shed as darkness pressed in. The place was a skeleton of its former self, boards missing, the roof sagging, the air pungent with dust and old grain. Inside, shadows danced across broken rafters. She stepped in, her breath shallow. The door banged shut behind her, and for a moment all was silent. The world balanced on a knife's edge. Then voices, gruff, unfamiliar, rose up from the gloom. She saw shapes moving, the gleam of gunmetal in the dying light. Too late, Lily realized she had walked into a trap. A length of rope looped down from the rafters, caught her neck, and yanked her backward. Rough hands pinned her arms. She kicked and struggled, the world spinning as the noose tightened. Laughter echoed in her ears, sharp and cold. "Let that be a warning, widow," a man hissed, voice muffled by a bandana. "You keep poking your nose where it don't belong, and next time, there won't be a warning." Panic surged through her, but Lily's mind raced. She forced herself to go limp, feigning defeat as the men loosened their grip. The world narrowed to a spinning tunnel of pain and fury. The only sounds the scrape of boots and the ugly snickers of her attackers. Then, sudden chaos. A door kicked in, splinters flying. Jake Collins burst through, revolver raised, eyes blazing with lethal intent. Gunfire erupted, the crack of shots ricocheting around the shed. Jake moved fast, a shadow among shadows, driving the gang off with wild, desperate ferocity. Lily, coughing, managed to slip free of the rope and scramble to the wall. The attackers bolted, retreating into the darkness, leaving Jake to help her to her feet. Blood dripped from a split in his scalp, but his eyes were clear. They staggered out into the open air, lungs burning, skin streaked with dirt and sweat. For a few moments they sat in the weeds outside the ruined shed, catching their breath. Jake pressed a flask into Lily's hands, and she drank, the whiskey burning away the last vestiges of shock. As she recovered, the pieces of the puzzle finally fell into place. Tom's signature on the note, the time trap, his absence during every attack. She saw it now, laid bare in the light of near death. Tom Harper, her husband's friend, the man sworn to protect the law, had betrayed them all for money and survival. Jake helped her up, anger radiating from every movement. Together they limped back toward town, Jake glancing over his shoulder, Lily clutching the journal tight. The night was dense with danger, but the truth had never felt clearer. They found Tom near the stable, lantern flickering in his trembling hand. Lily confronted him, journal open to the pages where his name was circled in John's frantic scrawl. Tom's face crumpled. He stammered apologies about fear, about desperation, about promises made in the shadows. He pleaded, voice thick with guilt, blaming the McCoy gang's threats and his own cowardice for every dark decision. Lily stood in silence, heart pounding, torn between mercy and rage. She remembered John's steady hand on Tom's shoulder, the trust that had been shattered in a single desperate night. Jake stood beside her, gaze cold, revolver at the ready, in case Tom's guilt turned to violence. But Lily knew what she had to do. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. She fixed Tom with a hard stare, voice steady despite the tremor in her limbs. He would answer for his crimes not in secret, but in front of the whole town. Justice was not a favor. It was a reckoning, and it was time for everyone in Dusty Creek to see the truth laid bare. The days after Tom Harper's confession bled together in a fever of planning and unease. Dusty Creek simmered with rumors, snatches of gossip carried on the wind, uneasy glances traded on Main Street, men riding in and out with little explanation. The air felt heavier now, every sunrise thick with storm tension and the sense that something monumental was about to break. For Lily Miller, there was no turning back. Her world had narrowed to the plan she and Jake Collins now shaped in the half-light of her battered kitchen. The journal and its damning entries spread between them. Jake paced like a caged wolf, always scanning the window, eyes sharp for the first sign of betrayal. Outside, the town looked the same. Dust blowing through the alleyways, church bell tolling on the hour, children chasing stray dogs. But Lily knew the calm was a lie. The McCoy gang and Tom Harper still moved in the shadows, and tonight would bring all of them into the open. They worked in silence, tension hanging between them like the thunderclouds gathering over the prairie. Jake mapped out the plan in short, urgent sentences. Lily would be the bait, drawing Tom and the McCoy gang into the open with the promise of a handoff, a chance to reclaim the evidence John Miller had died protecting. Word would be sent to the federal marshal, whose arrival in Dusty Creek was still kept quiet. A secret weapon poised for the final moment. Jake and two trusted deputies would wait in hiding, ready to spring the trap. Lily's role was clear and terrifying. Walk straight into the lion's den and trust her partners not to blink. She rehearsed every step in her mind, running her fingers over John's badge, letting the cool metal ground her when fear threatened to take over. The memory of nearly dying in the grain shed still haunted her. The rough pull of the noose. The laughter of men who thought her breakable. But rage burned hotter than fear now. She would not run. She would see her husband's killers brought to justice, even if it meant standing alone before the guns. As dusk settled over Dusty Creek, Lily donned her late husband's coat and hat, a makeshift disguise that felt both like armor and a burden. The streets were nearly empty, too quiet, as if the whole town sensed the coming storm and took cover behind closed doors. Jake waited outside, the brim of his hat pulled low, hand resting on the butt of his revolver. They exchanged a brief, wordless look before parting ways. Lily heading toward the agreed meeting spot, Jake disappearing into the shadows to take his place with the lawman. The rendezvous was set at the abandoned stockyard, a maze of pens and fences bleached silver by moonlight. The air was heavy with the smell of old hay and something sharper: anticipation, fear, maybe even hope. Lily moved slowly, every step deliberate, every nerve stretched taut. She carried John's journal in her satchel, the forged evidence wrapped inside, knowing it would be enough to lure every vulture in Dusty Creek. She waited by the largest pen, heart thudding in her chest, fingers brushing the cold grip of her husband's Colt. The minutes crawled by, the silence broken only by the restless shifting of a stray horse. At last, movement. Tom Harper stepped into the moonlight, face drawn and shadowed, his every gesture betraying guilt and dread. Behind him, the McCoy gang emerged, half a dozen men with rifles and hard eyes, led by the infamous Boone McCoy himself, whose reputation for cruelty preceded him like a stench. Lily stood her ground, every muscle tense. She forced herself to meet Tom's gaze, saw the shame and fear twisting his features. The gang fanned out, circling her, their boots crunching on gravel. Boone McCoy smiled, the expression never reaching his cold eyes. "You've been a thorn in my side, widow. Time to end it." But Lily was not alone, not tonight. In the darkness behind the fence, Jake and the deputies waited, the federal marshal among them, silent as the grave. As Boone demanded the journal, Lily took a step back, voice steady. She waved the satchel above her head, a silent signal. Jake's whistle cut the night air. Lawmen surged forward, guns drawn, shouts echoing across the pens. Chaos erupted, gunfire cracking, horses screaming in terror. Lily dove for cover, heart pounding, trusting that the plan would hold. Bullets ripped through the air, kicking up splinters and dust. Tom froze, torn between loyalty and terror, before bolting for the shadows. Jake tackled him hard, dragging him down as the marshal leveled his pistol at McCoy's chest. In the chaos, Lily clung to the journal, shielding it with her body, feeling the swirl of violence close around her. The trap had been sprung, but the fight was far from over. As the last echo of gunfire faded, the night seemed to pause, holding its breath, waiting to see who would still be standing when the smoke cleared. Lily, breathless and battered, rose from the dirt, her resolve stronger than ever. The showdown had come, and there would be no more running from the truth. The night was moonless, the sky a black velvet dome pricked with cold stars. Shadows shifted restlessly between the fences and old cattle pens, hiding the violence that was about to shatter the stillness. As Lily crouched low behind a splintered rail, heart hammering in her chest, the world shrank to the taste of dust on her tongue, the weight of John's Colt in her hand, and the hard edge of her resolve. The trap was set, but the outcome was still a gamble written in gunpowder and grit. Gunfire broke the silence, sudden and vicious. The first volley sent men scrambling for cover, bullets snapping through the dry air, slapping into fence posts and kicking up splinters. Horses screamed, rearing against their tethers, the whites of their eyes rolling with panic. Jake was in the thick of it from the first shot, moving with the calm fury of a man who had been waiting for this moment for years. He fired, ducked, reloaded, always pressing forward, his figure almost spectral as he moved through the maze of shadows. Boone McCoy's gang, caught off guard, scrambled to form a line. Boone himself barked orders, his voice rough and cruel, but the law had the advantage of surprise. The federal marshal's voice rang out, commanding the men to surrender, but it was answered with defiant gunfire. Tom Harper, panic painted across his face, tried to slink away, But Jake caught him by the collar, wrenching him into the open with a force that brooked no argument. Lily moved along the fence line, flanking the battle, the journal pressed tight to her chest beneath her coat. Her ears rang with the roar of gunshots, the shrieks of frightened animals, and the curses of desperate men. She saw Tom stagger under Jake's grip, saw the crowd gathering at the edges of the chaos, townsfolk drawn by the noise, their faces pale and fearful in the shifting light. There was no hiding from the truth tonight. Justice would be meted out beneath the eyes of all Dusty Creek. In the confusion, Boone made his move, trying to circle behind the marshal, his revolver raised, eyes burning with hate. Jake caught the motion, firing twice. The first shot clipped Boone's arm. The second sent him sprawling into the dirt, his pistol spinning away. The gang faltered, the fight draining from them, but still bullets cracked through the night. Sharp, angry, desperate. It was Lily who stepped forward in the lull that followed, blood running hot in her veins, hands steady despite the chaos. She called out Tom's name, her voice ringing clear across the stockyard. Tom, caught in the marshal's grip and with half the town as witness, looked small and broken. Lily held up the journal for all to see, reading the names and crimes written in John's own hand, daring Tom to deny it. His face went ashen, all the bravado and excuses stripped away. He stammered a few words, but the crowd pressed in, demanding answers. Jake kept watch over the gang, his gun never wavering. The lawmen rounded up the surviving outlaws, herding them toward the waiting wagons. Boone, bleeding and beaten, spat curses but found no friends left to back his threats. The townsfolk, emboldened by the sight of their tormentors unmasked, finally began to move forward, their fear melting into outrage and relief. Lily met Tom's eyes one last time. In them she saw not just guilt, but the reflection of every lie that had poisoned Dusty Creek. The marshal took him into custody, reading his rights in front of everyone. Tom sagged in defeat. Knowing that whatever mercy he might beg for in the shadows, none would be granted in the light of day. With the last of the gunfire spent and the night echoing with cries for justice, Jake turned his attention to Boone McCoy, delivering a final, unspoken reckoning. The feud that had haunted him for years ended not with a dramatic speech, but with the cold certainty of the law. The McCoy gang was finished, its power broken, its members shackled and silent. Lily stood in the wreckage, breathless and battered, but unbowed. The stockyard was littered with the detritus of battle, spent shells, splintered boards, the bitter tang of smoke hanging in the air. Above it all, the stars burned brighter, as if the sky itself was bearing witness to a reckoning long overdue. The townspeople gathered, their faces turned toward Lily, no longer with suspicion, but with something close to respect. For the first time, the burden she carried felt lighter. The promise she made to John fulfilled in blood and truth. The night's violence faded slowly, replaced by the first whispers of hope. Dusty Creek, once held hostage by fear and corruption, stood at the edge of something new. And Lily, though bruised and haunted, knew she had survived the worst. Her courage forged in fire, her spirit unbroken beneath the stars. Dawn crept slowly over Dusty Creek, pale and tentative, as if the sun itself was unsure whether to return after a night so torn by violence. The town that had trembled under the shadow of the McCoy gang now seemed changed in its very bones. The bruised sky was streaked with gold, the air raw with the scent of smoke, gunpowder, and trampled earth. Lily Miller stood alone in the battered stockyard, boots rooted in the dirt, the hem of her coat heavy with ash and sweat. All around her, the wreckage of battle told its silent tale, splintered fence rails, spent cartridges glinting in the weak light, the dried trails of blood that marked where men had fallen and been carried away. The night's violence lingered in every scar and shadow, yet the threat that had haunted Dusty Creek for months was finally broken. The McCoy gang, so feared and hated, was nothing but a bitter memory now. As the sun climbed higher, people began to drift from their hiding places. Men and women, children clutching at their mothers' skirts. The old and infirm blinking into the strange, hopeful new day. Their faces were marked with exhaustion, but also a tentative relief that bordered on disbelief. The gang's captives had been rounded up, shackled and silent, hauled off by the federal marshal and his deputies. Even Boone McCoy, stripped of his bluster and pride, shuffled away without a backward glance. His reign ended not by legend, but by justice and the courage of those he'd once terrorized. Lily watched the procession from a distance, John's badge warm in her palm. She remembered the vow she'd made in the silence after his death, the impossible burden she had carried in secret. Now, as neighbors approached her one by one, some to offer thanks, others still cautious but no longer hostile, she felt that weight begin to shift. There were nods of respect, hands offered in uncertain friendship, voices that dared to speak her name without the old venom. For the first time since John's murder, Lily felt the edge of belonging, the faint but unmistakable glow of hope. Jake Collins lingered near the gate, coat slung over his shoulder, his battered hat pulled low to shade his eyes. He looked every inch the drifter, dust-stained and lean, yet something in his posture had changed. The old, restless anger was gone, replaced by a calm resignation that spoke of debts paid and ghosts laid to rest. He glanced at Lily, his gaze sharp but softer than before. Their parting was brief, as such things often are in the West. Jake offered no speeches or apologies. He simply tipped his hat, nodded toward the horizon, and said, "Keep justice alive, Mrs. Miller." Then he swung up onto his horse and rode out through the morning mist, a solitary figure vanishing into the golden light. There was no need for more. His message was clear, a passing of the torch from one survivor to another. Lily watched him go, heart full of gratitude and something bittersweet. Jake had been both savior and avenger, a partner forged by circumstance and loss. His departure marked the end of a chapter she had never wanted to begin, and the start of another for which she was only now beginning to find her footing. As the day stretched on, Lily returned to her cabin, what remained of it. The windows were gone, the walls scorched, but she moved through the space with quiet determination, salvaging what she could, mending what could be mended. The town was still itself, still hard and unyielding, but something fundamental had shifted. Neighbors stopped by with wood and nails, tools and bread, their gestures awkward but genuine. The old suspicions melted, not completely, but enough that Lily could see a different future unfolding, slow and uncertain as the spring. She spent the afternoon on the porch, mending a shirt in the pale sun, John's badge beside her on the table. Children played in the street, their laughter a sound she had almost forgotten. And for the first time in weeks, Lily let herself believe that the world might soften its grip. The ache of loss remained, but now it was threaded with purpose. The battle had ended, but her fight was not yet finished. There would be wounds to tend, stories to tell, a town to rebuild in the wake of so much fear. Toward evening, as the sky blushed with the promise of rain, Lily wandered to the edge of the property, looking out across the fields to the distant ridge. The prairie stretched on forever, wild and empty, its silence broken only by the call of a lone hawk riding the currents of wind. She stood there a long while, badge warm in her hand, the ghost of John's presence at her side. The promise she had made was kept, but the legacy he'd left would shape every day that followed. Night came softly, with no thunder or gunfire, only the hush of a town learning how to breathe again. Lily sat alone on her porch, lantern burning low, and let the peace settle into her bones. She had faced the darkness and survived, had wrested hope from the jaws of violence, had taken her place as something more than the sheriff's widow. Now, in the quiet before the next storm, she belonged to Dusty Creek, and perhaps it belonged a little to her. The days that followed the fall of the McCoy gang unspooled like a slow, healing river through Dusty Creek. The town was quieter now. No more hurried footsteps after dark. No more whispers of coming violence. Where fear had once ruled, something like hope began to take root. The morning sun seemed brighter on the battered storefronts. The church bell rang with steadier confidence, and even the prairie wind carried a softer promise. Lily moved through the rebuilt town with a new purpose. Her cabin, once a scarred shell, now bore signs of life again. A fresh coat of whitewash, sturdy new shutters, flowers planted in neat rows beneath the window. The townspeople who had once shunned her now came to visit, bringing gifts of bread, fresh eggs, or simply the warmth of conversation. Children lingered at her fence, whispering tales of the widow who had stood up to outlaws, their eyes wide with awe. Lily found herself smiling more, her laughter echoing down Main Street on days when she remembered what it felt like to belong. But wounds lingered beneath the surface. The sheriff's office stood empty, John's star-shaped badge collecting dust on the windowsill, the weight of loss as present as ever. Each day, Lily polished the badge, thinking of all it meant: the burden, the danger, the trust the town had once placed in its lawmen. More than once, she found herself gazing out the window, the badge in her palm, wondering if she could ever step fully into her husband's shadow, or if she was meant to forge a new path of her own. It was the federal marshal who came to her first, hat in hand, his voice low and sincere. He spoke of the need for law and order, of the strength she had shown when others faltered, of how Dusty Creek was changing. The marshal made his offer plainly. He wanted Lily to take up the role of interim sheriff, to help guide the town through its fragile rebirth until an election could be held. His words were measured, but Lily saw respect in his eyes, the kind that had been missing from every conversation since John's death. She took her time to answer. The decision weighed on her, the risks, the scrutiny, the chance to disappoint those who had only just begun to trust her. Yet, as she walked the length of Main Street and watched neighbors greet her with nods instead of suspicion, Lily felt the shift inside herself. She was no longer just a widow haunted by loss. She was the bearer of a new legacy, one earned through fire and forged in the hardest kind of courage. On a morning swept clean by rain, Lily stepped into the sheriff's office with quiet resolve. She hung John's badge by the window, sunlight catching on the polished metal, scattering reflections across the desk where he'd once written his notes. The office was still, filled with memories, but now it seemed to breathe with the promise of change. She opened the ledger, wrote her name beneath her husband's, and began the work of learning what it truly meant to keep the peace. Word spread quickly. Some doubted, as people always do. Some scoffed, muttering that no woman should wear the star. But most watched and waited, curious to see if Lily's brand of justice could heal what violence had broken. She walked the streets daily, checking in on ranchers, listening to shopkeepers, settling disputes before they grew into grudges. With each passing day, the town's old wariness softened into a wary respect. Children ran to her with lost dogs and broken toys. Widows brought her news of neighbors in trouble. And the toughest men tipped their hats when she passed. The changes Lily brought were small, but steady. A new school bell, a fund for the families left behind by the gang, a patrol set up for the farthest homesteads. She worked alongside the marshal, learning to balance mercy and firmness, always guided by the memory of John's calm, steady hand. In moments of doubt, she sat on her porch, badge glinting in the light, drawing strength from the prairie's endless horizon. The town itself healed slowly. The scars of gunfights faded, replaced by laughter on Sunday afternoons, barn dances, and the steady rhythm of work. Dusty Creek was no longer a place haunted by outlaws, but a community held together by the stubborn hope of its people, and by the quiet leadership of the woman who had once been just the sheriff's widow. On the last day of spring, Lily walked to the edge of town as the sun dipped low, painting the prairie gold. She stood beneath the sky, her heart full of all she had lost and all she had gained, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new beginnings. She touched the badge hanging in the window, feeling the promise it held, not just for herself, but for every soul in Dusty Creek. As darkness fell, lanterns flickered in every home. The town slept easy, no longer gripped by fear, and Lily stood sentinel by the window, watchful and unbowed. Her journey had forged her into something neither she nor the town had expected. A keeper of justice, a symbol of hope, and a reminder that even in a land ruled by gun and grit, peace could be claimed by the bravest of hearts. And so, with the prairie wind whispering of dangers and dreams yet unseen, Lily faced the future unafraid, her story and Dusty Creek's only just beginning.